whole thing changed when I started to do my PhD. I discovered at that time the fields of cognitive science and data science. The perspective I assumed in my thesis, and it's what I think is one of the greatest theoretical news of the last decades, is that I think that the combination between cognitive science and data science in a way that allows us to have a sort of scientific approach, a naturalistic approach to study cultural phenomena. The complicated thing when you study cultural phenomena is, on the one hand, that cultural phenomena are in a way subjective, like in the sense that they are observer relative. When you find a poem sad, sadness occurs in your subjective experience. So the main question is, how do you study objectively facts that are subjective? And since recently, especially since the end of the 20th century, things like functional magnetic resonance has been developed. So with these kind of techniques, you can measure signals of brain activity, what happens in a person's mind when they are reading a poem that they consider sad, or reading something that makes them laugh, or making a moral judgment. It's amazing that now we can have some kind of naturalistic objective measure of this subjective phenomena, since we have the technology to do it in a theoretical framework, which I think is cognitive science, for doing these things. And on the other hand, you have the tools that are given by data science. And now we have huge databases, big data of people's behavior that gives you hints about how they are responding to something, like massive records of that. So in a way, it's like that's like a window into human behavior that allow us to make predictions, even statistical, if they are statistical, that are more accurate than ever before. And you can further inform these statistical predictions with your cognitive models. So I think the combination between cognitive science and data science gives us sort of the opportunity of a new naturalistic approach to study cultural phenomena. I did a research stay at the Stanford University, and they have this department called the Literary Lab, and they do their research, very interesting research, on they call it computer literary criticism, or some call it digital humanities. Basically, they have like large data sets of texts, typically literary texts, and they process that with computer power. One of these cases was a study that they were doing in the literary lab, when they will make many subjects read stories, and they had to mark each paragraph in terms of suspensefulness. They had to give it a rate as how much suspense they felt in the paragraph. Then they will load all this information into a computer, and the computer out of that would try to learn what linguistic fits were predictive of suspensefulness. And once they had a program that has above 80% of accuracy in predicting perceived suspensefulness, and once you have that program, you can run it across novels and across historical periods, and you can see, for example, the difference in the proportion of suspense in the literature of times of crisis, in the literature of peaceful times, for example, or in different countries, different ages. And this is also interesting. Also in the reader responses, the case study that I did in my PhD thesis was precisely to study reader responses and all the different meanings you could get for a same text by studying YouTube comments. I worked with the police song, Every Breath You Take, which is famously polysemic. You know, every breath you take, I'll be, in the end it says, I'll be watching you. And especially in this verse, you know, there are many popular interpretations. Some people say, oh, he's talking about the stalker because it says, I will be watching you. Some people say, no, it's a romantic song, clearly. Some other people say, no, he's talking about death. He's imagining someone that loves him, that died, and from heaven is saying, I will be watching you. There are many interpretations about this poem. And one very particular, that was particularly popular among literary critics, was that Sting was raising in this song this kind of a big brother nightmare, where the state is the one that is going to be surveilling and watching you, and that it was a sort of Orwellian nightmare. Then again, what I wanted to see is not what is the actual true meaning, but relying in the tradition of the reader-response criticism. If we know that different people will interpret different things in the song, I want to explore which people are interpreting what and in which situation. And when you start studying, plotting the comments, you realize that, for example, the most popular interpretation is that he's talking about the stalker, that the song talks about the stalker, but the interpretation of the big brother nightmare of the state watching you appears in peaks in, I think it was 2013, which is precisely when Snowden did reveal these documents of the National Security Agency, discovered that USA was gathering classified information about many countries in the world. So when that historical moment occurred, all these kind of words started to appear in YouTube comments, in the YouTube comments to this song. Big Brother, surveillance, NSA, Orwell, 1984, all these kind of things. So then again, the question is not which is the true reading, but which readings are more popular or more likely to emerge in each particular social group in different historical times. So then you realize that each literary work or each piece of culture, every movie, every post, every meme, every tweet, if you want, is as big as humanity. Because if you have enough tools, enough knowledge, you could calculate, or to a certain extent, you can get some information on how that would impact the world in different contexts. And I think this enriches the field enormously, the field of cultural research, I mean.
Of course, people might be commenting like there's surveillance, I'll be watching you, but there are a lot of so-called troll people who just don't mean what they say. You use some software, yeah? And this software, I guess, is not yet capable of distinguishing sarcasm, people not meaning what they say.
That's true. You have to be very careful. You also have to interpret the data, of course. You have to develop different solutions for the kind of databases you are working with. Then again, this doesn't have to be the end of the research. Then again, I didn't finish there. What I took from the data wasn't conclusions about, okay, people are interpreting this. As you say correctly, the only evidence I had was that people were talking about the subjects in that moment. The question is, how do you turn that into something that you can verify? So I turned into a hypothesis. So I tried to extract from this data the 4 or 5 main interpretations that seem to be occurring. And this hypothesis, I tested them. How? Directly with the survey. People had to read the lyrics of the song, and I would ask them for each of the interpretations, to what extent do you think that this song talks about state surveillance? Or to what extent do you think that this song talks about stalking or about love or about death? And people had to rate each interpretation from 1 to 10. After doing that, you have to respond also, how do you think other people interpret this song? To what extent do you think that others think this song talks about love? And you have to rate from 1 to 10. So what I have there is the way you interpret the song and the way you think others interpret the song. And at the same time, I had my hypothesis. So I contrasted the results of the survey with the hypothesis I had. And what happens is that the hypothesis was 35% more accurate in predicting the proportions of people's interpretations than people themselves were at predicting what others might be reading. The funny, more shocking example is that people typically give the highest score to this song is talking about stalking, but when you ask them, how do you think others interpret the song? They say, no, others think it talks about love. Like for others, they say that love is the biggest interpretation, but themselves, they know it talks about stalking. So what you get when you do the actual statistics is that most people think it talks about the stalking that has a higher score than love, the love interpretation.
It basically means that people tend to underestimate other people's cognitive abilities.
Totally. And then again, I think that's one of the tricks that makes the song work. Because what I noticed there is that most people were having the feeling that I know this song talks about this, but I'm sure others don't see it and think it talks about that. At the same time, I also made the sort of a socio-cognitive analysis, making people do different judgments, state their judgments regarding the implicit author, the narrator of the song, and the addressee of the song. And I studied how the interpretation that people made from the song affected what they thought of the judgment of Sting himself and of the voice singing and of the addressee. What you find is that people that consider the song talks about stalking, but at the same time really like the song, so they interpret the sort of a dissociation between the author and the narrator, which not all do. People that make that distinction, they think the song talks about stalking, but still they like it.
I just wanted to say one thing about comments like, oh, that's surveillance. I don't even understand how people might arrive to such comment to this song that was written in probably in the 80s.
Sting himself mentioned in an interview, I thought at the time I was probably reading 1989 by Orwell. So it's not the unfounded the interpretation. Then again, I think that my job is not necessarily to create a new interpretation, but to understand what people are interpreting there. If there's, I don't know, like 15% of the population saying that song talks about Big Brother, who am I to say that interpretation is wrong? I mean, it's like, in a way, yeah, you could ask the author if you want to know what is the intention of the author, but that's one kind of question. Another question, I like to see more the phenomenon in an impersonal manner. There's work out there, there's text out there, and there's a group of people that attribute this meaning to it. So it's not really relevant for me whether the text is saying that. I want to analyze reader response. Then again, I'm interested more in people than in works at this point. I hesitate a bit about talking openly about scientific field, because the amazing thing I find in this field is that emerges, you will call like nature and culture, or objectivity and subjectivity in a way. But I just want to clarify that not everyone doing cognitive cultural studies or digital humanities considers themselves they are doing science, because then again, these are tools that can be used for doing criticism of different kinds, for creating art. Many people use software to process language, to create what is called code literature. Code literature is the use of informatics, of coding, for creating software that writes literature. There are many fields of language technologies in which technologies are being used to process language and to create language. I like to call it like robots that read and write, and that are being used in many different fields. Code literature is one of them, but you can also consider the bots that are used for the automatic translators. You have what is called robot journalism, which is software that writes automatic news. It's also very much used in the World Cup or the Olympics to make like these little texts that show you the results in a very objective manner. They don't do an analysis, but they tell you the results of the football match. So that's another field where language technologies are applied. Then you have text generators, are these ones that make like artificial articles, text that resemble humanities articles or scientific articles. I think it's called SciGen, the one that does this for science. And at the beginning, that was used only for amusement, and you get like gibberish article that takes a resemble an article, but if you start to read it, it's just gibberish. But you can find new utilities for this. For example, some of these papers were used to send to magazines that had the reputation of not having a very good selection process or a referendum to decide which articles to publish. That's how the so-called Brickman affair happened. Sokal and Brickman are two scientists that sent one of these gibberish articles to a magazine to prove that the referatum was bullshit, and the article got published. And now it's used as a mechanism within the scientific and academic community to keep these magazines at bay, to control the publishing policies. In the particular case, again, of code literature, you can find in many festivals or meetups. You find people doing, for example, a software that takes words from Twitter and builds up like metaphors or pick up lines that make no sense or that are funny. There was another one that substituted words of novels by Jane Austen. I think it was Pride and Prejudice, and it took words and substituted them for words that appear in similar contexts in chats. So instead of getting whenever it says over, it will say over, you know, and instead, then it looks like a chat version of Jane Austen. So it's different. It's experiments. And when you find in code literature, and what I find interesting is that it has a sort of a second level of interpretation. When you read a work, you are led to imagine the personality behind that work, the subjectivity that might have issued those words and in which situation and for whom, and that affects how you're interpreting what you're reading. But when you're reading code literature, what produced that was the software. So you have the text that leads you to imagine the software that produced this, but then the software is a kind of an artwork that leads you to imagine the subjectivity that created the software. So you're led to see the computer behind the text and the coder behind the computer, something like that.
People sometimes forget about when they speak about AI conquering the world, AI is bad for humans, but they forget that AI wasn't born in nature. AI is the product of human activity. People
typically raise alarms about the danger of artificial intelligence when they refer to a field that is not their own. But when you ask people from the very field, very often you get like the opposite answer. For example, there are many people like complaining about this robot journalism. But if you search for interviews to journalists and to head of magazines and so on, they're very happy with this robot journalist. First, because it allows them to produce many more articles, and secondly, because the articles it produces is the articles that nobody wants to write in a magazine. So in a way, that allows them to remove a load from their shoulders and to free more time for the journalists to work in more interesting reports. It doesn't make a lot of sense for writers to feel this as a kind of competition, because it's like a different kind of literature. For me, it is as if people that run as a sport in Olympic Games will feel upset or worried about the invention of cars because they are faster than people, and they feel that will destroy their sport.
That's a good example.
And I think it doesn't make any sense, because literature, like running, and just like literature, is one of the activities that we tend to value the human element in it. Very interesting. Another field of language technology is chatbots. For example, I think like something like around 30% of users of of WhatsApp and Facebook and Instagram are directly bots, and they're used for many functionalities. They say something like in 10 years, like 80% of companies will have chatbots. Many people complain about the fact that now we have to interact with these bots, but at the same time, this frees a lot of people that don't have to do these painful jobs. So since I'm a bit of a techno-optimist, I tend to see the bright side of this. I see this as a progress, the fact that we can relieve people from this occupation by having some programs do it in a simpler way, in a cheaper way. Also, the more sophisticated we can do them, I think the better.
Speaking of chatbots, have you seen Google's presentation of their assistant called Duplex?
I haven't. Tell me.
They made it sound so good with this, okay. So like this breathing, like this,
all the details
here and there. There's just little things that people actually use in their speech. This was crazy.
I think that's a very important question. So it makes sense to try to make machines emulate humans to the point that they can deceive us. And that's also like a current debate in artificial intelligence. Many are saying that the fact that we can develop artificial forms of intelligence doesn't mean that we should try to do it in the direction of replicating a human mind or human faculties. Of course, sometimes it makes sense to replicate human faculties when we want to extend the faculty. For example, you have a capacity for doing algebra. Well, you get a computer that does it faster than you, a calculator, and that is great because it allows you to do it better. But to what extent do you need a calculator to resemble a human being or to make you feel that it's actually a subject doing that? I don't think that is necessary in most services. And then again, when a company goes down that road and decides to do something that really gives you the feeling that you are interacting with another human being, then raises the question of whether you should inform the other person if you are not a human being. And many find it creepy. That's something unarguable. I have many friends that tell me the only reason I don't buy an Alexa is that I find it creepy. So again, that is part of our psychology, and it's an open question. I don't know where this is going. But for the moment, I mean, I welcome that different kinds of designs are being tried. As long as people are duly informed, we will see which kind of bots fit better with the kind of world we want to live.
Hot seat questions. Will AI take over the world?
No.
No. Would you ever agree to implant a computer chip in your brain if it became mainstream or a state mandate?
Yeah, I would if I feel like it, not out of the state mandate.
That's the last question. What are top 3 qualities that you value most in people?
Empathy, curiosity, and humor.